Famicom approaches its second anniversary guns blazing. It's NES Works Gaiden episode 34. Famicom mainstay Hudson arrives with another licensed in-game. This one comes to us from Tekkon, creators of PLEIADS. But of course anyone who had been following SG-1000 would have known that already. According to Game Machine magazine, a 1980s Japanese trade publication focused on the arcade business that would occasionally provide comprehensive rundowns of console release dates, Sega shipped their adaptation of Star Force about a month before HUDSON'S hit Famicom. Lucky break for Sega. Impressive as their rendition of Star Force may have been, HUDSON'S absolutely demolishes it. Part of the difference between the two has to do with the disparity in hardware power, of course. The Famicom simply had superior graphical handling capabilities. Not only did it support per-pixel scrolling backgrounds at a hardware level, it could also move more sprites around the screen at a given time with greater fluidity than the SG-1000 could. And of course, it could display 3 or 4 times the number of colors available to the SG-1000. Those particulars really counted for a game like Star Force, which moves at a faster clip and involves a lot more objects moving around a lot more quickly than anything to have appeared on Famicom to this point. Sega deserves points for making a fairly impressive attempt on hardware that was never intended for such shenanigans, but the outcome was never in doubt. Of course, the other key factor in Star Force's excellence was Hudson. At this point, they demonstrated greater confidence and skill with Nintendo's hardware than any other third-party publisher besides Namco, and a box bearing the Hudson name guaranteed a good time. And why wouldn't it? Hudson had a leg up on the rest of the Japanese console industry, having worked closely with Nintendo on a few first-party releases. In fact, Ethan Johnson of Gaming Alexandria says that if Nintendo had its druthers, Hudson would have been the only third-party publisher for the console, a privilege bestowed upon them by Nintendo for their help developing Family Basic and Nyonin Uchi Mahjong. According to a profile of late Namco founder Masaya Nakamura in 4Gamer, it was only when Namco reverse-engineered the hardware and went to Nintendo to let the company know it was going to be publishing Famicom games with or without President Hiroshi Yamauchi's blessing that the console's general licensing program came into being. According to historian Stefan Ganser, Nintendo initially embraced 8 licensees, 7 arcade manufacturers plus Hudson, a computer-oriented publisher. This unique status would seemingly explain why Hudson's initial 1984 releases look almost exactly like Nintendo's from that era. From the bubble font title screen to the packaging design to the Nintendo-like catalog numbers conferred upon games. Namely, they were meant to be largely indistinguishable from Nintendo's own releases. Star Force feels like the first real effort by Hudson to work toward establishing its own unique style. Star Force plays pretty differently from anything anyone has published for the console yet, with its closest antecedent being, of course, Namco's XEVIOUS. You couldn't really call Star Force a XEVIOUS clone, though. Yes, it's a vertical shooter, but it moves a lot faster than XEVIOUS and features far more aggressive enemies. Star Force gives you both aerial and ground-based targets, but you have only a single weapon for taking them out. Terrestrial objects mostly exist to impede your fire, blocking your shots until you destroy the offending emplacement, which might dispense a bonus icon for your trouble. Star Force has a certain rhythm and mystery to it, which makes it more enticing than a simple brain-dead shooter. For example, why do ground icons make happy or frowny faces when you shoot at them sometimes? What determines when power-ups appear? Why do you have to defeat bosses in a few seconds or else they'll fly away? And while I certainly haven't played every single Japanese console to have shipped by June 1985, I feel pretty confident in saying that this was by far the speediest and most intense shooter to have shown up in Japanese homes to this point. Combine the convincing arcade-style action with a litany of intriguing secrets and techniques, and you have a game destined for success. To their credit, Hudson leaned eagerly into that success. Star Force became a centerpiece of the company's traveling caravan competitions, sort of promotional tour that let kids demo their new and upcoming releases while vying for prizes in scoring contests. And as I've mentioned many times by now, Star Force would be the shingle on which Tomoyuki Takahashi hung his career, becoming a minor hero to all the nation's little video game nerds for his ability to kick ass at the game. Star Force shaped Hudson's future direction, not only by splintering into their samizdat Star Soldier franchise, but also generally pushing the company to focus even more heavily on intense, challenging arcade-style experiences. You know, games like Wonder Boy. Like I said back when I covered the US release of Star Force for NES Works 1987, this one definitely landed differently in America versus Japan. Hopefully, seeing it here in the context of its original era and release helps to demonstrate why it was a big hit for Hudson, and why Tecmo decided to release it themselves beyond Japan. Somewhat optimistically, as it happens. The next arrival for Famicom also comes to us from arcades, where it also involved moving vertically along the screen shooting things. However, there's no mistaking elevator action for Star Force because for once, we have a vertical shooter on an 8-bit Japanese home console that takes no influence whatsoever from XEVIOUS. In fact, the original elevator action arrived in arcades at around the same time as XEVIOUS, so it represents a wholly pure interpretation of what it means to shoot things in a vertically scrolling space. For one thing, this space mostly scrolls downward rather than up. And while I say space, I only mean that in the sense of a place, not actually outer space or something involving spaceships. The only space elevator action involves is an office building with hallways and lobbies, and extraordinarily poor architectural planning. And you control a small man, not a metallic fighter craft designed for high-speed combat maneuvers in the yawning vacuum of the galaxy. The one thing elevator action has in common with XEVIOUS and its ilk, in fact, is the concept of height. XEVIOUS, of course, gave players the ability to fire at both airborne and terrestrial targets, while elevator action revolves entirely around the elevation of your attacks. In case you've missed it the past few times elevator action has appeared on this channel, this Cold War-era spy action title sees you controlling a secret agent who needs to collect classified documents while making his way down a skyscraper packed with enemies. You make your way to the ground floor via elevators and the occasional escalator as you and your foes take pot shots at one another. You attack laterally while moving in a primarily vertical direction, so the height of a bullet determines whether it strikes a fatal blow, sails over a target's head, or embeds itself harmlessly in the architecture. This also means you can duck or jump over an enemy's fire, or jump kick an enemy fatally in the face. And you can also use the scenery against them, crush a foe with an elevator, or drop a light fixture on their head by shooting it loose from the ceiling, and they end up every bit as unalive as they would be if you'd plugged them with your trusty sidearm. Well, anyway, elevator action is a known quantity here. But a less known quantity, at least for kids picking up elevator action for Famicom in June 1985, was the secret developer behind this port of the game, a ghost studio by the name of Micronix. To my knowledge, Micronix is only the second subcontractor to develop for third-party publishers on Famicom, the first being Tosei, who had mostly previously programmed Jaleco's games. Tosei had also handled Space Invaders for Taito, and that version turned out pretty rough. So maybe you can understand why the publisher played the field here a bit by working with a different programmer, and it seems to have paid off. Elevator action on Famicom is a convincing conversion. It's not quite on par with Namco's best, and it's certainly not arcade perfect, but it plays pretty smoothly and is remarkably faithful to the source material. Certainly it demolishes the choppy, frustrating port that Tosei would submit a few months later to Sega for release on SG-1000. Yes, this plucky upstart Micronix is quite promising. I see only good things ahead for them in the future, mark my words. And finally, Tosei continues undaunted despite Taito's betrayal, plying their trade with another arcade conversion for Jaleco, Field Combat. This one seems to be a quick conversion, arriving a mere 2 months after the coin-op releases debut in game centers across Japan. This one is, yes, another vertical shooter, our third for the episode, like elevator action and Star Force, but maybe somewhere in between. Since you scroll primarily upward and deal with both aerial and ground-based threats as in Star Force, but you also deal with a lot of humans on foot, as in elevator action. Although I think simply calling Field Combat a shooter does a grave disservice to its absolute bizarreness. Anyone approaching this game as if it were a mindless run-and-gun or an intense auto-scrolling pattern-based test of reflexes is bound to be bewildered by its reality, and they're bound to overlook some of its critical mechanics. If you really need to frame Field Combat by comparing it to other games, a better point of reference might be Taito's Front Line, which will make its way to Famicom before long, and Namco's Galaga, which of course we've already seen. Frontline was the game that really canonized the concept of a vertical shooter in which players control the foot soldier and had some level of control over the rate at which the screen scrolled forward. This format would become fairly popular over the following years, as we've seen with games like Commando and Ikari Warriors on NES, and Ninja Princess and Super Tank on SG-1000. But every game needs a gimmick in order to stand out, and for Field Combat, that's where Galaga comes into play. Or actually, maybe Galaga's sequel GAPLUS would provide a better point of reference. Rather than control a man or tank in field combat, you instead control what appears to be a flying saucer that doesn't fly. You can fire vertically up the screen a fixed distance with pinpoint explosives that use a rangefinder similar to the blaster bomb in XEVIOUS, as is more or less par for the course with this genre by now. Your secondary attack button, however, isn't really an attack. Instead, it's a tractor beam. You know how the cartoon image of UFOs is that they like to hover over abandoned fields and use a beam to pull hapless livestock or unsuspecting yokels into their hold in order to experiment on them, or to breed them for their space zoo, or whatever it is that UFO crews like to do with captive Earthlings? Well, Field Combat's UFO does something similar. Except here you're not hovering over an empty field, but rather a battlefield, and you don't hoover up wayward farmers, but rather enemy combatants. And you don't vivisect them for science, you brainwash them into serving on your side. Yes, Field Combat veers into Namco's territory here by giving you the ability to snatch foes and turn them into allies. Again, this concept emerged from Galaga, a game in which enemies could abduct your fighter and turn it against you until you liberated and repatriated it. In Galaga's sequel GAPLUS, you could turn the tables by pulling enemies out of formation and forcing them to fight alongside you instead. Sadly, GAPLUS wouldn't make its way to NES or Famicom for nearly 40 years when M2 developed a GAPLUS demake for Namco Museum Archives Volume 2 on Nintendo Switch, a game whose ROM could be extracted and made to run on real hardware. In the decades-long interval, though, there was simply Field Combat. Hoovering up opponents forces your UFO to remain motionless and vulnerable for a few seconds, but the reward justifies the risk. Once you've alien abducted some soldiers, or in later levels, mini-tanks or weird-looking combat cars, you can press both of the action buttons simultaneously to summon them into the field to fight alongside you. This semi-strategic element reminds me somewhat of BOKOSUKA Wars, a game that became infamous among NES fans in the early days of emulation for not really making its mechanics clear to casual ROM hoarders. I don't think the two games are that much alike, but there's more going on here than is initially evident with a quick, context-free play. Unless you know to hit both controller buttons simultaneously, and why would you, Field Combat just seems like a weird, slow shoot-'em-up with an inexplicable tractor beam. Now, this is by no means a classic of the Famicom, but it is more interesting than anything Galaga had put out yet to this point. At a mere 6 stages that consist of consistently hideous backgrounds, each of which is fairly brief and pretty easy to wade through as long as you can avoid the aerial attackers that like to harass you and steal your converted soldiers away, Field Combat doesn't have that much to offer, but at least it's not just more of the same. Next on NES Works Gaiden, Famicom turns 2 with some heavy hitters.